18. That is the number of times Russian aerial assets violated NATO airspace in 2025 alone, 3 times the number recorded the year before. Let that sink in for a moment. At the same time, Poland is now spending 4.5% of its entire gross domestic product on defense, the highest figure of any NATO member in the alliance's history. And Bulgaria, a country most analysts would never place at the center of a geopolitical storm, just signed a 10-year defense production agreement with Ukraine. These are not coincidences. These are signals. And if you know how to read them, they tell a story that is far more consequential than anything you will hear in a standard news cycle. Russia is not winning. Not in the way Putin needs to win. The shadow war he has been waging across Europe through drones, undersea sabotage, cyber operations, and proxy infiltration is producing the exact opposite of its intended result. Instead of fracturing Eastern Europe, it is forging it into something harder, something more unified, and something far more dangerous to Moscow's long-term strategic position. In this video, I will give you a strategic lens to cut through the diplomatic language and see what is actually happening on this board. We will follow the money, track the alliances, and identify the precise point at which Russia's calculus begins to collapse under its own weight. Because that point is not far away, and Eastern Europe already knows it. Let us start with Bulgaria, because if you want to understand the speed at which Eastern Europe is moving right now, Bulgaria is your most precise data point. On March 7th, a drone entered the airspace above Sofia, the capital of a NATO member state. Air traffic control and border police scrambled. Vasiliki Airport was forced to shut down temporarily. And while Bulgarian authorities were careful about naming a culprit publicly, with some even raising the possibility of Iranian origin, the strategic logic points in one direction. This was a test, and Bulgaria's response was not what Moscow expected. Within weeks, Sofia had moved on multiple fronts simultaneously. It formalized heightened defense cooperation with Greece, a fellow NATO ally with direct exposure to eastern flank threats. Greece committed to deploying F-16 fighter jets alongside a Patriot air defense system on its own territory, specifically to extend coverage northward into Bulgarian airspace. That is one ally physically repositioning its hardware because another ally asked. Bulgaria also reaffirmed its commitment to the Pearl Initiative, the framework through which EU and NATO members purchase American weapons for transfer to Ukraine. And then, on March 30th, came the move that no analyst in Moscow would have predicted 18 months ago. Bulgaria signed a 10-year bilateral defense agreement with Ukraine, joint drone production, joint weapons manufacturing, operations on both Bulgarian and Ukrainian soil, a decade-long structural commitment to the proposition that Ukraine will remain a sovereign state. Think about what that means strategically. A former Soviet bloc country, one with a historically significant pro-Russian political constituency inside its own borders, just placed a 10-year institutional bet against Putin's war aims. Bulgaria is not alone. Poland has emerged as the single most aggressive defense investor on the continent. 4.5% of GDP directed toward defense in 2025. 54% of that budget allocated to weapons procurement rather than operational costs and salaries. Warsaw is not maintaining a military. It is building one, the largest land force in Europe, by design. To the north, the Baltic states are moving with equal urgency. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have all accelerated investment in border fortifications and layered air defense. In Latvia, a NATO battle group anchored by a German brigade is being assembled with a readiness target of 2027. That timeline is deliberate. It reflects a specific threat assessment. And here is the development that fundamentally reframes the entire picture. Denmark, Finland, and Latvia have each signed partnership agreements with Ukraine under the Build for Ukraine initiative. These agreements are not aid packages. They are technology transfer arrangements. Ukraine, after more than 3 years of high-intensity conflict, has developed counter-drone interceptor systems and electronic warfare capabilities that no NATO member currently possesses at the same level of operational refinement. Eastern Europe is not simply standing behind Ukraine. It is learning from Ukraine, integrating Ukrainian battlefield knowledge into its own defense architecture. The country that was supposed to collapse in 72 hours is now functioning as the primary defense technology partner for an entire regional bloc. That is not a minor shift. That is a structural realignment. And Russia's shadow war campaign is the precise reason it is happening. Here's what European deterrence theory assumed: that any adversary, when faced with the credible threat of punishment, would weigh its risks, calculate its costs, and adjust its behavior accordingly. That is the foundational logic of NATO's entire strategic posture since the Cold War. Russia does not operate by that logic, and that single fact explains everything you are about to hear. The Center for European Policy Analysis released a report on March 31st that reframes the entire threat picture. Its conclusion is direct. Europe is no longer a witness to the war in Ukraine. It has become the target of a systematic shadow campaign, one designed not to defeat Europe militarily, but to dismantle it structurally, to corrode trust between allies, to paralyze decision-making, to make the cost of resistance feel higher than the cost of accommodation. A shadow war operates across 4 distinct vectors. Each one is calibrated for plausible deniability. Each one is designed to stay below the threshold that would trigger a conventional military response. And together, they form a coherent strategic architecture, not a series of isolated provocations. The first vector is proxy infiltration. Right now, inside the borders of European Union member states, Russia maintains a network of proxy actors, criminal enterprises, and recruited nationals whose job is to create chaos without leaving Russian fingerprints. Chatham House has documented cases in the United Kingdom of individuals allegedly working on behalf of Russian intelligence. Germany has arrested suspects on suspicion of planning sabotage operations at Moscow's direction. In Sweden, a series of railway derailments carried the structural hallmarks of coordinated interference. In Estonia, a country that sits at the hinge point of NATO's entire eastern shield, Russian security services have been actively recruiting local citizens, building what analysts assess as a potential internal disruption capability. The strategic purpose here is not destruction, it is division. Every act of sabotage that goes unattributed creates political friction inside the targeted country. It generates public debate. It empowers voices that counsel restraint. And right now, inside Bulgaria, a pro-Kremlin political bloc is preparing to use that country's new defense agreement with Ukraine as a campaign weapon ahead of parliamentary elections on April 19th. That is not a coincidence. That is the operation working exactly as designed. The second vector is undersea and energy infrastructure targeting. This is where the shadow war becomes most difficult to counter because the assets being targeted are both critical and legally ambiguous. Since 2023, 11 undersea cables across European waters have been cut or otherwise damaged, according to Politico. In the Baltic Sea alone, between 2022 and April 2025, there have been 6 suspected sabotage incidents. In the Gulf of Finland, 2 confirmed infrastructure incidents occurred within an 18-month window. Ships, some identifiably Russian, others registered under flags that provide cover, have been repeatedly observed loitering in proximity to undersea cable networks. When confronted, Russia claims ignorance. Without incontrovertible forensic proof, Europe has no legal trigger for a military response. Russia knows precisely where that line is, and it is operating just beneath it. The third vector is aerial provocation. In 18 documented airspace violations in 2025 alone, 3 times the rate of the previous year. These are not navigation errors. The timing pattern is instructive. When NATO announced Operation Eastern Sentry on September 12, 2025, a direct response to a Russian drone incursion into Polish airspace. A Russian drone entered Romanian airspace within 24 hours. Days later, 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets penetrated Estonian airspace and remained there for 12 minutes, ignoring all communications until NATO scrambled its own aircraft. The message was precise. Your announcements do not deter us. The fourth vector is cyber and information warfare. King's College London tracked 505 incidents of foreign information manipulation between November 2023 and November 2024. Those incidents spanned 90 countries, involved 322 organizations, and produced 68,000 individual pieces of content across 25 platforms. Ukraine, Germany, France, and Moldova were the primary targets. The objective is not simply to shut down systems. It is to manufacture polarization, to make democratic societies distrust their own institutions, to create the kind of fractured political atmosphere in which strategic consensus becomes impossible. Here is the critical insight that most analysts miss. Russia's intelligence and security services are institutionally rewarded for taking action, not for achieving specific outcomes. Operations are validated by the fact that they happened, not by what they produced. That means escalation is structurally incentivized inside the Russian system. Europe's deterrence model has no answer for an adversary that benefits from the act of provocation itself, regardless of the result. But here is the strategic irony that Putin failed to account for. A campaign designed to divide is producing unity. Every drone over Sofia, every severed cable in the Baltic, every cyber operation targeting a European election, each one is adding another layer of political will to the eastern flank's determination to prepare for what comes next. The shadow war is not winning. It is accelerating the very coalition it was designed to prevent. There is a concept in strategic analysis called the point of culmination. It is the moment at which an offensive force has expended enough resources, absorbed enough attrition, and overextended enough of its operational capacity that forward momentum becomes structurally impossible, not defeated in a single engagement, not broken in one decisive battle, simply unable to sustain the weight of its own ambition any further. The data emerging from multiple independent sources suggests Russia is approaching that point. Not tomorrow. But the trajectory is no longer deniable. Begin with the military picture. Russia's anticipated spring offensive has not delivered the territorial consolidation that Moscow's strategic planners projected. Ukraine has not collapsed under sustained pressure. Its military institutions, its command structures, and critically, its population's willingness to continue resistance have all proven more durable than Russian operational planning assumed. What we are seeing on the Eastern Front is not a stalemate in the traditional sense. It is a grinding attrition campaign in which Russia is absorbing personnel and equipment losses at a pace that is increasingly difficult to replace through conventional recruitment and domestic production alone. The evidence for this assessment is structural. Russia has been supplementing its frontline forces with North Korean military personnel and Kuristurkanki Hatsarikashinor Hadgar Wasana Harshinor, a deployment that carries enormous diplomatic cost and signals a domestic recruitment problem that Moscow cannot openly acknowledge. Signing bonuses for Russian contract soldiers have escalated sharply. When a government must pay significantly above market rates to fill military roles, it is communicating something about the true state of voluntary participation. These are not indicators of a force operating from a position of strategic strength. Now follow the money, because financial data does not negotiate with political narratives. Russia's central bank has maintained interest rates at extraordinary levels. Kyiv School of Economics and independent monitors tracking Russian war expenditure have documented the severe inflationary pressure building inside the Russian domestic economy. Energy revenues, which form the structural foundation of the Russian federal budget, have been compressed by the G7 price cap mechanism and by Europe's accelerated diversification away from Russian supply chains. The customers that Russia lost in Europe have been partially replaced by China and India, but at significantly severely discounted pricing and under terms that structurally favor the buyer. Russia is selling its primary export at a fraction of its former market value to avoid complete isolation. The arithmetic of the situation is not sustainable over a multi-year horizon. Defense expenditure is consuming an expanding share of a federal budget that is simultaneously under revenue pressure. Social spending, the mechanism through which the Kremlin maintains domestic political stability, is being crowded out. The IMF and independent economic monitors have flagged this dynamic as a medium-term vulnerability that compounds with every additional month of conflict. Then there is the alliance dimension, and this is where the strategic picture shifts most decisively. The 10-year defense agreement between Bulgaria and Ukraine is not simply a bilateral arrangement. It is a public signal from a NATO and EU member state that it is institutionally committed to Ukraine's long-term sovereign existence. When a government signs a decade-long production and cooperation agreement, it is embedding that commitment into procurement cycles, industrial planning, and parliamentary budget frameworks that outlast any single administration. That is political architecture, not rhetoric. Multiply that signal by Denmark, Finland, Latvia, Poland, and the Baltic states, all moving in the same direction, all deepening structural ties with Ukraine simultaneously, and you begin to see what is actually forming on Russia's Western strategic horizon, not a temporary coalition of the willing, a durable regional security architecture in which Ukraine is a load-bearing pillar. Bruno Kahl, former head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, has assessed that Russia may seek to directly challenge a NATO member state before the end of the current decade. The German military's general inspector has made parallel assessments. These are not fringe analytical positions. They represent the mainstream threat calculus of Europe's most capable intelligence apparatus. But here's the question those assessments implicitly raise. For Russia to execute that kind of escalation, it would need a military and an economy that have successfully absorbed 3 or more years of high-intensity conflict and emerged with sufficient regenerative capacity to open a new strategic front. The data points outlined above cast serious doubt on whether that condition will be met. Culmination points are rarely visible in real time. They are usually identified in retrospect. But the indicators, financial, military, diplomatic, and industrial, are converging in a way that serious strategic analysts cannot responsibly ignore. Russia is not collapsing, but it is contracting, and the direction of that contraction is not reversible through shadow warfare alone. Before we go further, intellectual honesty requires something that most channels in this space will not give you: a genuine counterargument. Because the history of this conflict is littered with premature declarations of Russian collapse, and every analyst who has made that call with excessive confidence has been forced to revise their timeline. That pattern deserves respect. Here is what the other side of this argument looks like when it is made rigorously. Russia has demonstrated a capacity for economic adaptation that Western sanctions architects did not fully anticipate. The pivot to Chinese and Indian markets, while structurally disadvantageous in pricing terms, has prevented the kind of complete financial isolation that would produce rapid systemic failure. The Russian domestic economy has not imploded. It has reconfigured, painfully, inefficiently, and at significant long-term cost. But it has reconfigured nonetheless. The political cohesion inside Russia, while difficult to measure accurately given the information environment, has not visibly fractured in ways that would signal imminent internal instability. Authoritarian systems have historically demonstrated a capacity to absorb economic pain for longer than liberal democratic models project. On the Western side of the equation, the strategic picture carries its own uncertainties. The United States, the single largest contributor to Ukraine's defense capability, has shown signals of policy ambiguity under its current administration. European industrial defense capacity, despite significant announced investment, may not reach operational readiness until 2035, according to assessments cited by Euromaidan Press, potentially 5 years after the window in which NATO generals assess Russian conventional aggression becomes becomes most likely. And inside countries like Bulgaria, pro-Kremlin political movements are not marginal. They are organized, they are electorally relevant, and they are preparing to contest the very defense agreements we discussed earlier. The strategically precise conclusion here is this: the difference between Russia weakening and Russia collapsing is not semantic. It is the difference between a multi-year managed decline and an acute systemic failure. The evidence supports the former. The latter remains, for now, an analytical overreach. What the data does support is a Russia under compounding structural pressure, moving in one direction, unable to reverse course, but not yet at the terminal point. That distinction matters because how Europe responds to a weakening Russia is entirely different from how it should respond to a collapsing one. Let us pull back from the battlefield and follow the consequences outward, because what is happening in Eastern Europe right now is not contained to Eastern Europe. It is radiating. The first ripple is architectural. The security order that governed post-Cold War Europe, centralized, Brussels-anchored, dependent on Franco-German strategic consensus, is being quietly replaced by something more distributed. Poland, the Baltic states, and now Bulgaria are not waiting for Paris or Berlin to set the pace. They are building bilateral and multilateral arrangements directly, at speed, with Ukraine as the central node. A new Eastern security spine is forming inside NATO's existing structure, and it is being built by countries that have the most direct threat exposure and therefore the least tolerance for strategic ambiguity. That structural shift has economic consequences that are already measurable. The Bulgaria-Ukraine Defense Production Agreement is a template. Joint manufacturing of drones and weapons systems across two countries' industrial bases creates supply chain interdependency that is deliberately designed to be difficult to reverse. Defense contracts of this nature generate engineering jobs, logistics infrastructure, and technology transfer pipelines that persist for decades. For Bulgaria, for Poland, for the Baltic states, is purely a security expenditure. It is an industrial policy decision with long-term economic returns. The build for Ukraine partnerships signed by Denmark, Finland, and Latvia follow the same logic. Ukraine's drone interceptor technology and electronic warfare systems represent genuine battlefield-tested innovation that no NATO defense contractor currently offers at equivalent operational maturity. Eastern European governments are acquiring access to that knowledge base before it becomes a commercial product. That is a strategic economic advantage, not simply a defense arrangement. Now consider the individual citizens sitting inside one of these countries. The political conversation they're being asked to engage with is fundamentally this: sustained defense investment now, measured in budget allocations, in industrial retooling, in mandatory military service discussions already underway in several eastern states. The incalculable cost of a conflict that reaches their own territory. That is not an abstract geopolitical question. That is a question about tax allocation, about where young people spend 2 years of their lives, about which industries receive government capital. The final ripple extends well beyond Europe's borders. Defense ministries in Taipei, Seoul, and Tokyo are studying this conflict with a precision that goes far beyond academic interest. The operational lessons Ukraine has generated, particularly in drone warfare, electronic countermeasures, and distributed logistics under sustained pressure, are integrated into Indo-Pacific defense planning in real time. What began as a regional European conflict has become the primary live laboratory for 21st century warfare doctrine. A butterfly moved its wings over Sofia on March 7th. The air is still moving, and the countries that understood what that drone actually signaled are already positioned differently than those that did not. The question now is not whether this realignment is happening. It is whether the pace of preparation will match the pace of the threat. So here is where we land, and here is what the data will not resolve for you. Eastern Europe is moving. The alliances are forming, the defense agreements are signed, the industrial partnerships are operational. Poland is armed. The Baltic states are fortified. Bulgaria has chosen its side. And Ukraine, the country that was given 72 hours, is now the strategic anchor of an entire regional security architecture. Russia is contracting. Its finances are under compounding pressure. Its military is absorbing losses it cannot publicly acknowledge. Its shadow war is producing the coalition it was designed to prevent. And yet, the most dangerous moment for any declining power is not when it is strong. It is when it recognizes that its window is closing. A cornered strategic actor does not always retreat. Sometimes it escalates, and that is the variable that no model can fully price. That is the question sitting at the center of every intelligence assessment across every NATO capital right now. What does Putin do when culmination becomes undeniable? That answer is coming. And when it does, the analysis you need will be here. If this gave you a sharper lens on what is actually happening, subscribe now, because the next move on this board is already in motion, and you will not want to be behind on it.